Imagine it. The year is 1837. The newly elected and inaugurated President Van Buren was not new to the White House. He had been serving the White House for years as vice president, and now as president. Truly, this was exciting. However, the excitement was short lived. For only 2 months into his presidency, the Panic of 1837 hit. Less than 20 years since the last panic, the Panic of 1837 was the worst financial crisis of the entire 19th century. Now, similar to today, it doesn't really matter who was most recently in office. It just matters that who is in office right now. A great example of this is something that will happen nearly a century later in the form of a stock market crash. When Hoover was inaugurated in March, the stock market crashed in October. It's easy to forget that Calvin Coolidge was actually in that office for 6 years compared to Hoover's 7 months before the crash happened. Did Hoover make the crash and ultimate depression worse? Yes, but was he the cause? No, not really. The same thing can be said for Martin Van Buren. Was it his fault that the Panic of 1837 happened? Obviously not. He had only been in office for 2 months, and by all accounts, it was really leaning more towards Jackson, his predecessor. But did he make it better? Not necessarily. But before we criticize how he went about it, let's figure out how we got here in the first place. Similar to 1819, we were experiencing a boom, and Europe was all in on it. This time, it was less about crops and more about specifically cotton. And as one could probably guess, slavery at this point in U.S. history was at an all-time high. While we were enjoying our boom, England was also having one of their own, so they decided to invest in U.S. transportation systems. With new options, cotton prices dropped in demand because of the increased supply. Just like that fateful day in January of 1819 when the price of cotton dropped by 25%, now cotton farmers in 1837 were not able to suddenly pay payments on their land where they were growing all this cotton. If that wasn't bad enough, the wheat crops were being decimated by the Hessian fly, so wheat began to skyrocket in price. This was detrimental for many Americans, many of whom began starving. By the time the panic set in, Europe was barely importing any crops from the United States. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that in addition to the real estate bubble, Jackson pulling all federal money out from the Second Bank of the United States was a major contributing factor to the panic. Many of the banks that the deposits were being shifted to were out west, so the banks in the east were seriously lacking in being able to back up the funds in their reserves. This meant banks had to cut back on loans and often raise interest on the ones that were already existing. When the panic hit in May, citizens blamed politics. Democrats blamed bankers. The Whigs blamed Jackson, and everybody was pointing at Van Buren. Much like Hoover, Van Buren did not want to get the government involved. Despite what experts were saying and the suggestions being brought to him, he didn't offer any emergency relief or an increase in public works projects to combat unemployment. The entirety of the United States felt the panic, though not necessarily at the same time. It started with the North, and made its way to the South, and eventually made its way out west. 60% of all American banks shut down, and 62 were on the cusp. And many states defaulted on bonds that directly impacted British creditors. So the U.S. withdrew from international money markets for nearly a decade. One field that didn't hurt during the panic was law enforcement. Due to the riots and civil unrest, the police departments across the U.S. just expanded and grew in power. The depression caused by the Panic of 1837 stretched across 7 years before the economy truly began to recover. But by the end of the 1840s, the U.S. was in another economic boom. For more information about the presidency of Martin Van Buren, please check back on my episode about his tenure.